Hello everyone, good afternoon, thanks for coming out. So as Katie mentioned, my name is Shannon. I'm the interpretive naturalist with Marin County Parks, which for the most part means that I'm out leading walks for the public. All of our walks are free. We also have ranger walks and volunteer stuff, so you can visit our website. We've got an events calendar. I typically do 1 or 2 walks a week and then sometimes come and do things like this. So today we're going to concentrate on the wildflowers around here locally. Tiburon Peninsula has some really wonderful plants and some rare species, all of that. But first we're going to dive into kind of some basics about plants. So we'll talk about the advent of flowers and how the world really dynamically changed with the evolution of flowering plants. We'll touch upon the relationships that plants and animals have, how they interact with each other. We'll discuss some of the strategies that plants use to disperse their seeds, and then we'll kind of briefly touch on some of our local species. And I'll give some tips on how to identify them. All right, but first let's go way back in time, before flowering plants were around, before any plants were really on the earth. If you think about terrestrial habitats, way back when, there wasn't any. There weren't any plants on land, there weren't any animals, and so it was just a bunch of rocks and dust from those rocks. But there wasn't even soil because there weren't plants or animals living on land to die and decompose and turn into soil, right? So all of the plants were in the water, and there were algae, like filamentous green algae, that eventually started to creep up on land. And they eventually evolved into the early land plants, like ferns and mosses, things like that we're familiar with now, and some other stuff. And all of those early land plants reproduced by spores. And this might come as news to some of you, but plants have sperm and they have eggs. And so spore-bearing plants actually require water, even if it's a thin little film of water, for the sperm to swim through to get to the eggs, and then fertilize, and then start a new plant, right? So for a long time, there were these early land plants that were reproducing by spores, and they were tied to water. They had to be in environments where there was water in order for them to reproduce. Then eventually, what we call gymnosperms evolved. Gymno means naked, sperm means seed. So these are plants that actually have seeds, but they don't have flowers. And just the evolution of seeds was huge. It really helped plants to expand and get into different environments. These are mostly pollinated by wind, but that seed helps protect the embryo from drying out, and it also gives it some nutrients to get started. So if we look at the numbers, the algae, there are about, currently in the world, about 22,000 species. The spore-bearing plants like ferns and mosses and stuff, about 10,000 species. And then the gymnosperms, there are only about 1,000 species. And of those, only about 600 are conifers. So in the entire world, there are only about 600 conifers. And flowering plants, there are 300,000 at least species of flowering plants. So this is really kind of astounding. You think about the evolution of flowering plants, and the plant world really took off. So how did they become the most diverse group of land plants? One of those things is because they got help. And so if you think about it, earlier I mentioned that if you had spores, you have to have water, right? The gymnosperms were wind pollinated, and so they could only really grow and reproduce in areas where the wind was just right. But with enlisting animals like insects and some other animals, basically the flowers then could be anywhere where those animals were. And it turns out that flowers and insects have co-evolved. And so this relationship evolved, plants or flowers evolved during the time of the dinosaurs and just exploded. And so a lot of flowering plants have evolved since then, a lot of insects have evolved since then. All right, so let's break down how this happens. So flowers are wanting to, first I should mention that not all flowering plants are pollinated by animals. We do have some flowering plants that are pollinated by wind, like grasses are a great example, right? but a lot of them are attracting pollinators, and so they've got flowers that we think of as pretty. They're showy, they've got colors, they've got petals, things like that. And so down here, let's see if I can get the pointer to work. This doesn't seem to be working. All right, anyway, down here, kind of at the base of the petals, is where the nectar is. Not all flowers have nectar, but a lot of flowers do. And so nectar is basically to attract pollinators like insects, and it's sugary, so it's an energy source, it tastes good, all this good stuff, right? And so nectar is produced in very specific parts of the flower that kind of get the, let's just say a bee, come in a very predictable way. It goes to a predictable part of the flower, it moves around in a predictable way. In the course of that, it's rubbing up against the male structure that's producing the pollen. So it's getting pollen on its body, right? And then it flies to the next flower because the nectar was so good at the last flower once more, right? So it goes to another one. And then it comes into contact with the female structure. And so the female structure has this sticky tip on the top that basically grabs onto the pollen. So the pollen gets transferred kind of passively in a lot of cases by these insects just moving from flower to flower. That female structure also contains the ovules, which are the eggs. And I kind of want to just step back for a minute because right now we're talking about flowers and insects and everything. And so it's easy to just think about this happening on a hillside with all these pretty wildflowers and stuff, and that's kind of the importance of all of this. But we really rely on pollinators for a lot of the food that we eat. If you think about it, most of the food that we eat are flowering plants in general. That again includes grasses like wheat and corn and rye, stuff like that. Even if you eat meat, those animals are eating flowering plants. But then the pollinators are responsible for so many of the fruits, the nuts, the vegetables that we eat. All right, so back to how this works. So pollen grains have, this is under a microscope, they've got all of these little sort of barbs and sticky things, and they're also just kind of have a sticky texture to begin with. So that means that they easily stick to these pollinators, and then they get transferred to that female structure. The top of the female structure is sticky, but also sometimes, like for instance, when a bee is flying around, it actually kind of takes on a static charge, and then when it comes near the flower, that female structure is grounded, so it also kind of attracts just through that sort of different pulls, it attracts the pollen to that structure. And then if we look inside the female structure, what happens is pollen grains land on the top, and I'm going to super simplify this. For every pollen grain, there is one part that creates a pollen tube. It kind of grows down through the female structure to the ovules, and then down that tube, the sperm flows. And so it goes down, and so it fertilizes one of the eggs. So for every egg that gets fertilized, you need one pollen grain, right? So if you imagine a fruit with a whole bunch of seeds, that means a whole bunch of different pollen grains have landed on it and grown a whole bunch of different pollen tubes. All right, so attracting pollinators. A lot of flowers are showy or colorful or bright. They've got all these different aspects that we're going to talk about, and some have evolved specific traits for specific pollinators. So one thing is pollen, right? So pollen is how they're reproducing. It's containing that the sperm, basically. It's the way that plants get fertilized. So pollen is crucial. And some insects are just eating pollen straight up. So like beetles actually are one of the largest groups of pollinators in the world, which is kind of surprising. A lot of people don't think of that. And it's primarily because they like to eat pollen. And so they're getting into flowers, and they're coming out looking like this, right? So they are messy eaters. In fact, this type of pollination is called mess and soil pollination. So they get in there and they eat the pollen, they also eat the petals, they just eat the different structures, and in the process they get covered in pollen, and then when they go to the next flower, they're transferring that pollen. Flowers also produce scent. And so a lot of insects have really strong olfactory senses. Their antennae are picking up on scents. And so a lot of them are attracted to sweet, spicy smells like bees and moths and butterflies. So a lot of flowers are producing scent to attract pollinators. Some of them are producing really bad smells. And so some insects like like in the fly family, like gnats and things like that, and little flies are attracted to rotting things, they're attracted to fungus, because that's where the females lay their eggs. And then once the eggs hatch, they feed on whatever that thing is that's rotting or the fungus, right? But some plants have learned to mimic those smells. So things like fetid adder's tongue, fetid actually means like foul smelling, right? So fetid adder's tongue has a bad smell. California pipevine also has an unpleasant smell. And so it's attracting little fungus gnats because they think it's a place to lay their eggs, and in the process they get covered in pollen. And then they go to the next flower. So here's a look at the pipevine. And do you see these dark spots in here, these kind of shadows? Those are fungus gnats trapped inside of the flower. And so it's giving off this bad smell. The gnats go in through the opening in the flower, and there are all of these hairs that are kind of facing inward. So as the gnat goes in, it goes in really easily, but when it tries to get back out, it has a hard time getting out around those hairs, right? And so they end up trapped in there for about 24 hours or so. They are flying around, they're trying to find their way out. At the top of the flowers, if you look at the one on the right-hand side, you can see this light area. That's kind of like a little window at the top. So they go up and they try to get out that way. In the process, they get covered in pollen. And then after about 24 hours or so, those hairs inside relax, and then the gnats can get out. Wow. And so then, because they're not quick learners, they end up and they smell another flower and they go inside, right? Anyway, so that's how these plants get pollinated. And then some flowers produce extra chemicals like caffeine. So citrus is known to have caffeine in its nectar. And when bees come and visit it, it kind of stimulates their reward center in their brain. So then they learn to associate that smell with that sort of excitement. And it makes them think that, like, oh, that was really good. I want to go to another flower and have some more, basically. So it's known that citrus has, some citrus at least, has caffeine in the nectar. We don't know if other plants do or not. And then also nicotine. So this genus Nicotiana, or like the coyote tobacco, has been shown to have nicotine in its nectar, and there may be others within that genus that do as well. And it's similar to the response is similar to the caffeine. This I think is super, super cool. So there's been a study that was done on evening primrose, and they discovered that the petals of the flowers kind of act like a satellite dish. And so they did this study using, I think, 5 different sounds, and they tested it out on, I feel like I'm rubbing up against something that's giving an annoying sound. So they did a recording, they did silence, they did a recording of a bee, of a honeybee coming within 4 feet of the flower. They did a low frequency, medium frequency, and high frequency sound generated by a computer. And then they tested it out on these flowers. And the flowers actually responded to the recording of the bee and the low frequency, which is kind of about the same sound that a bee makes, right? So in response to these sounds, these flowers ended up producing more nectar with a higher concentration of sugar within, I think, like a 20% higher concentration of sugar within a few minutes of hearing those sounds. And so this is really interesting. I don't know of any other studies on other plants, but I just think it's super cool that the flowers are actually hearing those insects coming along and being like, well, let's up our game. Snapdragons are also potentially capable of doing this. There hasn't been like a peer-reviewed study, but there's some evidence that at least some species of snapdragons may do this as well, increase the amount of nectar they're producing and the sugar concentration. All right, visual signals. So insects can see in the ultraviolet range, we can't. And so flowers look really different to them. So for instance, you can see on the left side is what we see, on the right side is basically what the bees see. So a lot of flowers have patterns on them that help direct them to the center of the flower where the nectar is, the pollen is. A lot of flowers have nectar guides, so I think of them as kind of little runways, with lights, like, come here, this is where the nectar is. And so when these are typically pollinated by bees, when the bee goes in, this is the top structure, this is the lower, so when it goes in, the the anther, the male part with the pollen, is like this, and so it rubs over the bee's head, and then when it goes to the next flower, the little female structure is this little flap up above as well, so they basically are brushing the pollen into that little flap as they go in and out of these flowers. More nectar guides on violets. And this is just an idea of what the bees are seeing. So on the left is kind of how we see the flowers, and on the right is how they're seeing the flowers with these really striking patterns. So if you can compare kind of the way they're seeing compared to us, they are seeing far into the ultraviolet range, so they're seeing blues and purples, things like that, more than we do. We're able to see in the reds and oranges, and if you note that insects don't really see red, right? They're starting over here in the spectrum. So they don't see red very well. So a lot of flowers that are particularly have evolved to attract bees are either blues or purples or pinks, kind of on that end of the scale. And just really quickly, a couple really cool things about these flowers that are pollinated by bees. In lupins, have you guys noticed that sometimes you see the lupins start out having a white banner, the part that's like this, and then later on they turn darker purple like this? So that's thought to be something that happens as those flowers age, and it's a way of signaling to the bees that those have probably been visited, and so it directs them to the fresher flowers. So it's beneficial to the bees, it makes their foraging more efficient. And it's also beneficial to the flowers because that way the ones that haven't been visited are more likely to get visited. And then over on the right is a shooting star, and this is one of our early blooming plants, and bumblebees are one of our early flying insects. And they do what's called buzz pollination. So we have a lot of different plants that have buzz pollination. And what happens is instead of having like the typical male structure with the pollen on top, the pollen is packed in a little tube, basically, and it requires a vibration to shake that pollen out of that tube. So when a bee flies in, it's vibrating its flight muscles. You can actually hear it. Let's say this is the flower, right? So it flies around, it's like bzzz, and then goes bzzz, and then bzzz, bzzz. So if you're nearby a buzz-pollinated spot, you can actually kind of hear that. So what they do is they come up, they hang upside down, they grab onto it with their mouth parts, they vibrate their flight muscles, and it shakes out maybe like 10% of the pollen, and then it lands on the belly. And when they go and they visit another shooting star, the female structure is hanging down even lower, and so it brushes up against that pollen, right? Again, the fact that sometimes the pollen's kind of jumping off of the bee's body onto the female structure also helps in that situation. Bees are brushing the pollen off of their bodies periodically and packing them on the hind leg here. And then they take that back and they feed it to their larvae. So there are some flowers that don't even produce nectar because the bees they're after the pollen, they want the pollen. And in the process, they're not getting all of the pollen off their body, so they're transferring it. All right, so back to this who sees what. So birds can also see in the ultraviolet range, but they can see reds, whereas remember the insects can't, but birds can. And so that's why a lot of hummingbird specialist flowers are red. And it's not because they can see red better than other flowers, it's that the insects don't see red. And so it's helping the flowers with these very specialized pollinators to sort of weed out the ones that aren't going to officially or effectively pollinate the flowers, right? So if this is evolved to be pollinated by a hummingbird, if a bee were to get in there, it might take some stuff without effectively pollinating it. Does that make sense? So it's kind of weeding out the insects. So in this case, you can see like over here is columbine. It brushes, the pollen ends up on the forehead of the bird, and then when it flies up to the next flower, it transfers that pollen to the female part. And these really long tubes on the back of the flower, those are the nectaries. So the nectar is produced all the way up at the top of those. So it requires something with a long tongue to get up there. And then on the other side is honeysuckle, very similar. Some moths have really long tongues, so they can get in and get nectar from stuff. And in some cases, they're not very good pollinators because they're not really touching the flowers, right? But some get closer, some have shorter tongues, and they are actually effectively transferring pollen. Here's another, these are just so cool, snowberry clearwing. This is larkspur, again with that long floral tube, that the nectar's all the way at the tip of that. And I just wanted to show you, these are bee mimics. So this is actually a moth. It's a big, big moth, but it doesn't have scales on its wings, and its body has all this pattern and fuzzy stuff to look like a bee. They're very cool. Okay, and then we've got some evening bloomers that take advantage of moths, like I was just showing you. Some are day active moths, and then some that are flying at night. And then things like soaproot also are pollinated by bumblebees during the day. Okay, so I was mentioning that you have one pollen grain per egg, right? That's how fertilization happens. But what if you're a plant with a ton of seeds? That would mean a lot of pollen grains would have to land on that flower, right? And so some plants have evolved this strategy to kind of buy in bulk, basically, right? So here we have what are called pollinia, and this is the leg of a bee, and then you can see these sort of sticky structures right here, and then they have these sort of wings. And each of these wings is a mass of pollen. And so that way, a whole bunch of pollen grains can be transferred at once instead of just each individual grain. So some flowers have evolved this strategy, like milkweed is one. And if you look at the structure of this flower, it's a really interesting looking flower, right? And that's not by accident. It's because when the bees land on it, their feet fit into these little grooves between the petals, and in between those little petals are these pollinia. So you can see here the dark sticky gland, and then the wings would be kind of down there. So when the bee lands, their feet hit that sticky part, sticks to their feet, and they pull their legs out, and then they're attached to their feet, and when they visit the next flower, they have these specialized slits that when they visit those pollinia go into, and when they lift their feet out, it sticks into the flower. So a way of transferring a whole bunch of pollen grains all at once. This is an orchid pollinia. They have the same strategy, only on these, the pollinia is up toward the top of the opening of the flower. They kind of hang down so that the bees end up looking very fancy when they visit them. So they get stuck on their heads usually. I just love this photo. And then in orchids, so you've got over on the left side, this is spotted coral root, this is in bloom. And then on the right side, once it's gone to fruit. And inside those fruits are a gazillion little seeds. And so you think about how many pollen grains, individual pollen grains it would take if they were just being transferred individually, right? So using the pollinia is really helpful in this case. And then these seeds are like dust. They're so lightweight. So those fruits split open and the seeds are dispersed on the wind, which gets us into seed dispersal. So these are called blowwives, and these are dispersed by the wind as well. If you think of dandelions, these are in the aster family, the sunflower family. A lot of things in that family are wind dispersed. And so they've got a seed, and then they've got a little parachute, so they float through the wind. Some fruits, some seeds are dehisced. They've got dehiscent fruits. And so here's some lupin. Up at the top, you can see the fruits are still kind of fresh. They're still green, and then they start to dry out. And when they get really dry, if you picture, like if you ever have, green beans or snap peas or anything, they've got two halves with kind of almost like a little belt around the middle, right? You can split those into two halves. So as these dry, the pressure on that sort of belt gets tighter and tighter until it finally gets dry enough and it splits. And when it does, they twist like this and they fling the seeds. So they fling the seeds away from the parent plant, but still, close enough that it's still good habitat and all of that stuff. So dehiscent fruits. And then this is like crane's bill, stork's bill, and they have these long, long fruits. That's where the name comes from, because if you look at it sideways, it looks like a crane's bill. And when they dry, they turn into these little coiled things with kind of little hairs on them. So they can, as they're drying, they can sort of dig themselves into the ground. But the main thing is seed dispersal. So a lot of different plants have just sticky things, a lot of grasses especially, that stick to the fur of animals, or people's socks or shoelaces or whatever. And then if you picture it on an animal, that animal's probably gonna get it all over its fur, wander a little while, and then sort of bathe itself, groom itself, take them off, and then that's dispersing those seeds to a new place, right? And then rodents are responsible for dispersing seeds. If you think about, acorns and things like that. But even things like this wild cucumber, these seeds are known to be dispersed by rodents. And if they just land on the ground, even if they get watered, they really don't germinate. They rely on rodents to bury them in the soil. And so this plant has really close association with rodents. And then, of course, birds. So a lot of plants produce berries. And so you've got the seed inside and then this sort of fleshy, sweet part. So that attracts birds. Birds eat them. It goes through their digestive tract. It scarifies the seeds, which basically means they get a little roughed up, which the seeds need before they can grow. And then it defecates, not too far away from the parent plant, hopefully in the same sort of habitat, so it's still going to be a good place to grow. And it defecates the seed and a little pile of fertilizer with it, right? So birds disperse a lot of seeds. One of the coolest things is ants. There's something called myrmecochory, which Greek means ant dance around, I think is how it literally translates. Anyway, so ants are dispersing a ton of seeds. And the reason why is because a lot of plants have evolved what's called an elaiosome that's stuck to each seed. And this has evolved independently in, I think, like over 50 different plant families. And so it just tells you how efficient this is to use ants to disperse your seeds, because ants are all over the world in all different habitats. And so this kind of sticky clear part right here has a bunch of like lipids and all sorts of good stuff that the plants, or that the ants actually feed to their larvae. So they'll collect the seed, take it back to their nest, take that elaiosome off, feed it to their larvae, and then disperse the seed. Get rid of the seed and they're like trash mittens, right? And so that way the seed is being, again, dispersed away from the parent plant, but it also ends up in a place that's nutrient rich because all of their other organic waste is ending up there. And in some cases it's underground, so they're also burying it. So these are just examples of different seeds with elaisomes. Trillium are one of the species that we have here, one of the groups that we have here that creates elaisomes. So they're ant dispersed. And this is what their fruit looks like. And once it's opened up, you see all the seeds with elaisomes and these very excited ants. Fetid outer's tongue, I was talking about how they attract fungus gnats to pollinate them, but they also employ ants to disperse their seeds. So they have elaisomes as well. After the flower blooms, this is also called slink pod, because the fruit kind of tips over and ends up on the ground. Easy access for the ants. All right, so now we can take a look at some of the wildflowers of Marin. We have a lot of different habitats here, which means that we have a lot of diversity here. There's an amazing number of flowering plants here in Marin. And if you think about it, we've got open habitats like oak savanna, we've got grasslands, we've got scrub, coastal scrub, and chaparral. All of these host different types of plants. And then wooded habitats like mixed evergreen, riparian, redwood forests, wetlands, both fresh and saltwater. And then serpentine, which is super, super important for a lot of our native plants. So serpentine is a type of rock that's formed basically kind of where you have tectonic action. And so you've got water added to the parent rock of this that ends up making it kind of slippery and buoyant. And so as you've got plates moving together, it ends up getting squeezed up and then it hardens. And so it ends up at the surface, kind of exposed, and then as it erodes, you end up with these serpentine soils. So serpentine soils are really, really toxic. They're really hostile to plants. They are really low in nutrients that plant needs. So if you think of going and buying fertilizer that's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, it's low in all of that stuff. It's really high in heavy metals, which plants don't like. It's high in magnesium, super high in magnesium, which isn't good for plants. And it doesn't hold water well. It doesn't have aluminum, which is how soils or how clay is created, and that helps to hold water. So it's really shallow and water drains out of it really quickly. So it's not a great place to live if you're a plant, but since all of these like European grasses have taken over this area, we've got a lot of non-natives that were brought in when Europeans brought cattle. If you think of the rolling hills, golden hills of California, those are non-native plants, right? And so serpentine ends up being this area where our native plants can kind of take refuge because they've evolved with these soils and they can eke out a living, where a lot of these non-natives can't. They just can't survive in those areas. So serpentine is really, really important to a lot of California natives. It's also where we find a lot of our rare plants. And here, if you think about, if you glance up on these slopes up here, there's a lot of serpentine. So we have a lot of serpentine soils, like Old St. Hilary's and Ring Mountain, those areas. And so there are a lot of native plants and rare plants here. So let's get at it, the plants that you can find around here. So probably the most famous for this area is the Tiburon mariposa lily. And this is serpentine endemic, meaning it only grows in serpentine. It only grows at Ring Mountain. And even at Ring Mountain, we have a researcher who's been studying the Tiburon mariposa lily for almost a couple decades now, and has discovered that even up on Ring Mountain itself, you have little pockets where the serpentine has slightly different properties. The pH is different, the chemicals are slightly different. And so you can have the mariposa lilies over on, let's say, the east side, and if you took their seeds and planted them on the west side, they might not do that well. So very, very localized with these very particular requirements. This is a bulb, so even like through the drought, they did okay. They can just kind of hunker down and not use a lot of energy. They can wait until the conditions are better to send up leaves and to bloom. And then we have the Tiburon jewelflower, which grows at Old St. Hilary's. And unlike the Tiburon mariposa lily, it's an annual. So as I was saying, the mariposa lily has a bulb, so that means that it can survive harsh conditions. But this is reproducing seeds and dying back every year, right? So this is actually kind of in more danger of going extinct than the mariposa lily. So this is at Old St. Hilary's. We're trying to introduce it to Ring Mountain as well, see if that population takes, just to try to ensure its survival. And both of these flowers are late bloomers, so they typically come up late May into early June. And so a lot of the other flowers we're going to talk about are blooming right now and through April, but these you find a little bit later. These are specialized to be pollinated by bumblebees, so they've got this really interesting structure, the shaped flower, and so the bees can get in there and open them up and access the pollen, and I'm not sure if they have nectar or not. And then we have the Tiburon paintbrush. So this is, the last two species I mentioned are only found on the Tiburon Peninsula. This has a much bigger range. This is scattered throughout Marin, and if I remember correctly, I think there are some small populations down in the South Bay. We have a lot of different paintbrushes, and this is a subspecies of a much more common paintbrush that we have. But it's really pretty. It's kind of this pale yellowish color. And one of the best spots to see it is at Ring Mountain, kind of out on the west side. There's a trail that kind of goes down. It's like a little peninsula. And then the Tiburon buckwheat. This is another subspecies of a more common buckwheat that we have all around. But this particular one is a rare plant. And these are tiny. I mean, it's like you could easily walk past them. But when you get an abundance of them, again, serpentine endemic, it just looks like there's this pink haze over the ground. And so really, really little flowers. And then the Marin dwarf flax. This one is pretty abundant where it exists. But again, it's a small flower. A lot of the things that are growing on serpentine are doing a little with a little, you know? And so a lot of these are small plants. And so they have this kind of pink blush to them. And they're in the flax family. Anyway, lovely little flower. And then the Oakland star tulip. This, again, is pretty common in this area, and you can see a whole bunch of it. Like if you go to Ring Mountain, you can get slopes that are just kind of studded with it. There's another rare plant that looks a lot like this. which is a different species of calochortus, and it's a little bit bigger, and it likes really wet spots. So both of these occur at Ring Mountain, but this is the more common one. One thing I'll point out, I love it when flowers have purple or violet pollen instead of yellow or orange, right? And then this is one of our death camas, zigadine, if that name rings a bell with anybody, star lily. We have really common species of this. This is a different species. The flowers are quite small, and again, this really likes wet spots, so you don't see this that often. And then I thought I would just mention this. This isn't a rare plant, but it's very uncommon in Marin. This grows at Old St. Hilary's. If folks have been up there, you know where the chapel is? Down in that area. I haven't actually seen it, but there are still current records for it there. It has a global distribution, but it's just kind of a cool plant to be able to see if you time it right. And then common species. So we have several different species of lupins, and this is one of the most common ones. This is sky lupin. We also have bicolored lupin, which looks super, super similar, but it's smaller and the flowers are smaller. Again, these are pollinated by bees. It's really fun to sit down and watch a field of lupin being visited by bees, the way that they work. They just, they're so fast. It's pretty cool too. I mentioned the color change that's sending a signal to the bees. Also, when bees land on flowers, they have glands on their feet and it leaves a little scent mark. So if another bee comes right behind, they can tell that the nectar's, it hasn't refreshed its nectar yet, right? Like, oh, a bee was just here, and so they just pass it. So it's fun to watch bees foraging on these. They're super fast. All right, and then we'll kind of go through these by color, just for lack of anything else. So milkmaids are our earliest bloomer. These are very, very common all over the county. They're typically in woodland habitats, and they just really kind of glow, you know, in the shade. This is our earliest blooming flower, so they're typically blooming in December, and then they have a pretty long bloom, so they'll continue to, different plants will continue to bloom for months. And then this is the more common star lily or zigadine or death camas, whatever you want to call it, the bigger one that's much more common. One thing that is another serpentine endemic, actually both of these are, is rosinweed. And this is pretty cool. You can get this just covering whole slopes, like at Ring Mountain. There's one area where you start, if you're up around Turtle Rock and you start to go down the hill, that whole slope can be covered in this. It's called rosinweed because it has these little glandular hairs. Another name is tack stem. So they're kind of these hairs, and then at the end, they've got this little gland, and it's very, very sticky. And so that helps to inhibit insects from eating it. And then over on the right-hand side is pitted onion, and we only have this in a few places, and it's got a pretty limited distribution. So it's not a listed or rare plant, but you don't see it that often. But there's a bunch of it at Old St. Hilary's and a bunch of it at Ring Mountain. And then yarrow is a very, very common plant. Some people have it in their yards. Some people have kind of cinnamon-colored ones or yellow ones, right? My understanding is it's all the same species. Those are just different cultivars. But in the wild, it's only white. And so it has these flat-topped umbels. The flower cluster is, if you think of an upside-down umbrella, right? An umbel kind of has different spokes coming up with little clusters of flowers on top. And very, very ferny leaves. And then over on the right is hairy-petaled hog fennel, which always sounds like, I don't know, some kind of insult to me, right? But it also has very ferny leaves, and it's got umbels. If you look at the flowers, they are indeed hairy-petaled, so they kind of have a fuzzy look to them. This is super common. A lot of times you see it right along fire roads, things like that. And for the most part, both of these are pollinated by flies. A lot of flowers that are pollinated by flies are white or cream, or, you know, like we were seeing the fetid adder's tongue and the pipevine. They're not super showy and colorful. And then we've got a lot of things in the sunflower family. So one thing that I think is interesting about this family is when you look at this looks like one flower, right? It's actually what's called a composite flower. So in the middle, that disc is full of separate little flowers, tiny, tiny little flowers. If you look under a microscope, you can see them. And each of those have reproductive structures in it. So if you think of a sunflower, you end up with all of those seeds in the middle, right? Because those have all been fertilized. And then what look like petals are also actually flowers. If you pull off one petal, sometimes you can see a little reproductive structure. Sometimes those flowers are sterile, they're not turning into seeds, but they're responsible for attracting the pollinators, right? So on the left is gold fields, very, very common, and it's a good name. You end up with just fields of gold. This is typically really low growing. I was just up at Mount Burdell and saw some that was almost like a foot tall, I think, just from the rains and where it was. But it's normally low growing. And then tidy tips have that white border around the edge, which is why they're called tidy. We do have one species that doesn't have the white around the border though. Buttercups, it looks like they would be in that same family, the sunflower family, but buttercups are in their own family. But same idea, lots and lots of pollen in the center, and then it's called buttercups because it looks like melted butter, really, really shiny petals. Those petals are attracting the pollinators. And this is one of the ones that has, like under UV light, it looks like it's got a big bullseye in the middle. And then over on the right is suncups. Low growing, this is in the evening primrose family. It only has 4 petals, opposed to a lot of our other yellow flowers. One thing to note is that a lot of flowers are kind of this color yellow earlier in the season, when everything else is really this lush green. The yellow just really pops. And so yellow is a color that kind of across the board insects really see really well. A lot of these flowers have an open structure, so that means anything can land on them. It could be a bee, it could be a fly, it could be a moth, it could be a beetle, and all of those are potential pollinators. So these are generalist flowers. One thing that's interesting is on the suncups, the ovules are actually underground, and so the seeds develop underground. And so the pollen tube has to grow from the flower all the way down underground, and then the seeds develop underground, which is interesting. I've had a hard time finding out who disperses these. Some things reference ants, and then I've also heard that rodents will dig them up and in the process eat some of the seeds, but kind of aerate the soil and disperse some of the soil. Disperse some of the seeds. Okay, so this is Pacific snakeroot on the left. Super, super common, especially in woodlands. If you look at this leaf, it might look familiar. There is a ton of it this year. A lot of leaves are popping up this year. And then it has kind of a not very showy flower, little greenish yellow flowers. And then over on the right is turkey pea. And this smells exactly like cilantro. If you crush the leaves, and this grows in serpentine. This is a serpentine endemic. And so that's one way there are a lot of things in this family that kind of have this look to them. But if you smell the leaves, that can help you differentiate between species. So this one smells just like cilantro, grows in serpentine. It never really gets too big. And then our monkey flowers. So the seep monkey flower, it's called seep monkey flower because it really likes wet spots. So it grows in drainages, it grows in ditches. We have really, really big ones that could be this tall with big flowers, and really, really small ones with the flowers about this big. And those have now been split into different species. But one thing that's consistent are these red dots in the throat. Sometimes they're really heavy, sometimes they're slight, but they've always got a little bit of red dot, those red dots in the throat. And then on the right-hand side is sticky monkey flower. Really, really common. You find this in woodland habitats and out in chaparral. It's pretty drought resistant. This has an interesting relationship with the butterfly caterpillars of buckeye and variable checker spot. They both eat the leaves. There are chemicals in the plant called iridoid glycosides. A few plants have that. And so the caterpillars eat those, they sequester those toxins in their body, and then that makes them unpalatable to birds and stuff. So it acts as a protection. So the caterpillars eat all the leaves, but toward the end of the summer, the sticky monkey flower, kind of as a defense, drops most of its leaves, and the remaining leaves, it produces more resin on, so they get super sticky, and that makes them unedible to the caterpillars. But of course, the caterpillars have a counter move. So they go into what's called diapause. They're just like, okay, we'll just wait. We'll wait it out. And so they go down, they kind of overwinter, or they hang out for, I should say, the fall for the most part. And then once we get rains and the plants start pushing out leaves again, they come out of that sort of hibernation sort of state, and then they start chewing again, and then they turn into butterflies. So a bit of an arms race there. And then these two are in a group of plants in the Orobanchaceae family, the broomrape family, and everything in this family is parasitic. So some are completely parasitic and some are just partially parasitic. These are grassland species, both of these, so they've got little structures on their roots that are tapping into the roots of other plants and stealing nutrients. But they also have green on their leaves, so they're producing a bit of chlorophyll, which means they're able to make some of their own sugars. So on the left here is cream sacks. Again, you find these up at these preserves, and then also owl's clover is really, really common, and you can find it on and off serpentine in a lot of different places. And it's called owl's clover because if you look, it looks like they've got little faces, kind of like little perched owls there. We talked about the shooting stars before. Again, early blooming, these are buzz pollinated. And then on the right is checker bloom. Really, it's a type of mallow. It's in the mallow family. Really kind of large, really pretty flowers, mostly a grassland species. And I just wanted to point these out. These are both kind of invasive, non-natives, but very common. I showed you the fruits of the storksbill, the filary, right? Those are the ones that get those crazy spiraled seeds. We have several species in this group. It's the geranium family. They all have pinkish purple flowers. And then this one over on the right is one of my favorite non-natives. I think it's quite pretty. This is actually in the iris family, rosy sand crocus. And a lot of times it grows in disturbed areas, like in the middle of fire roads. And it closes up at night, the flowers do, so you can walk right past them, not see them. And if it's an out and back and you come back in the afternoon, all of a sudden the road can just be covered in these lovely little pink flowers. So that's kind of fun. Blue decks are super common. There are a lot of them blooming right now. There's another species, ukau, which looks very, very similar, that blooms later in the season. If you want to know how to tell them apart, come out on a walk with me and I'll explain it in the field. But very, very common. Oh, I just realized I haven't changed. The genus on this has changed. It's now Dipterostemen. And then on the right is blue-eyed grass, another common plant. This is in the iris family. Things in the iris family have three parts on their flowers. So these flowers are actually 3 petals, and then the larger ones are actually sepals. Like if you picture a rose, the sort of green leaf-like things right at the base of a rose, those are the sepals. So these are modified sepals to do what, do you think? Attract pollinators, exactly. So make the plant more showy. Hound's tongue, early bloomer, really lovely plant in forested habitats for the most part. And then larkspur. We have several species of larkspur. The western larkspur is found here in Tiburon. Again, that long nectary, so it's pollinated by hummingbirds and moths. And then bee plant is aptly named. Bees and yellow jackets love this plant. They stick their head inside and their little bee behinds stick out. This is in the snapdragon family. And then over on the right is the wavy leaf soaproot. And this only blooms in the afternoon or evening. If you look at the Latin name, Corabellum pomeridianum. Pomeridianum means, po means after, meridian is noon. So the species name is telling you it blooms in the afternoon. And that's it.